Hello friends, you're on the Just Think channel. If you're not interested in questions about consciousness, life after death, and the nature of our reality, if you're not ready to think about things that science still doesn't have a final answer for, then maybe this video isn't for you. Because today we're going to dive into one of the strangest and most debated topics humanity has ever pondered. Reincarnation. Is it just an old belief, or is there something more to it? Some children around the world tell stories that can't be explained by just imagination. They say names they've never known, describe places they've never been, and remember events that, by all logic, they couldn't have lived through. But here's the big question. If memories are stored in the brain, and the brain stops working after death, then how is it even possible to remember a past life? Is it a mistake, an illusion, or are we missing something about the nature of consciousness? In this video, we'll explore what philosophers said about the soul moving on, what modern science shows us, if there are real cases that puzzle scientists, and where the line is between what we know and what we don't. This isn't science fiction, and it's not trying to make you believe anything. It's an honest attempt to understand a question that has bothered humanity for thousands of years. And maybe, by the end of this video, you'll see yourself in a whole new way. Before we talk about science, we need to understand the idea itself. What does the word reincarnation even mean? In its simplest form, it's the belief that after death, the body dies. But something we call consciousness, a soul or self, it doesn't disappear. It keeps on existing. And it can show up again, in a different body. This idea isn't new. It's been around for thousands of years and is a central part of traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism. There, it's believed that life isn't just one straight line, but more like a cycle. Birth, life, death, and then birth again. But there's one important thing to understand. In these teachings, it's not necessarily about the same person just moving from one body to another. Sometimes it's described more like a flow, like a continuation of some inner essence, rather than an exact copy of the old person. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because if we take away religion and try to look at it from a neutral point of view, the main question remains: what exactly is supposed to carry over from one life to another? Memory? Personality? Consciousness? And if this something really exists, where is it stored? Modern science gives a pretty clear answer to this. All our memories, our personality, our habits, and even our sense of self are connected to how the brain works. Neurons, electrical signals, complex biochemical processes. All of this forms who we feel we are. And when the brain stops working, from a scientific point of view, the personality also disappears. But then there's a contradiction. If everything that makes us depends on the brain, how can any of that continue after it dies? This is where the line begins between what science explains and what is still an open question. And to understand how much this idea even has a basis, we need to look at what not religion said about it, but thinkers who tried to explain the world using reason. Before modern neuroscience, brain scans, and experiments on consciousness came along, people were already asking a question that still doesn't have a final answer. What are we, really? A body, or something more? And if the body dies, do we disappear with it? One of the first people to try and answer this question, not through myths but through thinking, was Pythagoras. For him, the idea of the soul moving to a new body wasn't just a belief. It was an attempt to explain how life keeps going. Pythagoras started with the idea that there's order, harmony, and things that repeat in the world. Numbers, proportions, the way planets move, everything follows certain rules. And if the universe itself is like a system, why should life be any different? Why should consciousness just show up once and then disappear forever? This is where the idea of metempsychosis comes from, not as something magical, but as a guess that life might be a process, not just a one-time event. But this idea gets even deeper with Plato. Plato doesn't just ask about the soul, he asks about what knowledge and consciousness really are. In his book Phaedo, he tries to use logic to explain why the soul can't be completely tied to the body. One of his main points is the idea of remembering. It goes something like this. We can understand big ideas like equality, beauty, or perfect math, even if we've never seen them perfectly in the real world. We see things that aren't perfect, but we know they're not perfect. How do we know that? Plato figured that if we know something is not perfect, it means we already have an idea of what perfect is. So, knowledge doesn't just come from what we experience, it's already there in some way. This means the soul existed before we were born, and learning isn't about making new knowledge, but about remembering what we already knew. This isn't an experiment or a measurement, but it's a very strong logical idea. Plato isn't proving reincarnation in the way we think of it today, but he shows that consciousness might come from somewhere not limited by the body. Centuries go by, science grows, physics, biology, medicine appear, but the question doesn't go away. And in the 19th century, Arthur Schopenhauer comes back to it. His approach is very different. Schopenhauer doesn't talk about personalities moving to new bodies. He's even doubtful that you can stay the same after death. Instead, he talks about will, a deep universal power that is the base of all living things. From his point of view, what we call personality is just something that shows up for a little while. The brain, memories, personality, these are all just forms. But the will to live itself doesn't disappear. It just shows up again, in different forms. This isn't reincarnation in the popular sense anymore. It's not, you'll be born again as a different person. It's the idea that life is one continuous flow, where being an individual is just a temporary stop. And here's where a very important difference comes up. When we say reincarnation, we usually mean that your personality stays the same, your memories, your character, your feeling of me. But philosophers often ask the question in a different way. Not, does the personality stay the same? But what is the real me anyway? If personality is a bunch of memories, and memories depend on the brain, then after death they disappear. But if me is something much more basic, not tied to a specific body, then the question becomes much harder. And this is what philosophy leads us to. The idea of reincarnation isn't silly. It can be explained, talked about and built upon, but it stays at the level of ideas. Philosophy can ask the right questions. What is consciousness? What is personality? What does it mean to exist? But it can't answer the main question. Does it actually happen in real life? And this is where we hit a wall. Because after this, we get into an area where just thinking isn't enough anymore. We need facts, experiments, observations, and that's why the next step is to see what modern science says. And here, the answers become much tougher. If philosophy leaves a question open, science tries to give the clearest answer possible. And this answer, at first glance, sounds pretty tough. Modern neuroscience says everything we call ourselves, our memories, our personality, our feelings, our habits, is the result of how our brain works. Not some abstract soul, but a real physical system. Billions of neurons, trillions of connections between them, a constant exchange of electrical and chemical signals. It's in this complex network that our self is made. When you remember your childhood, certain brain pathways light up. When you make a decision, specific parts of your brain are working. When you feel fear, love, or joy, this comes with measurable chemical changes in your body. And this isn't just a theory, it's proven by experiments. For example, if certain parts of the brain are damaged, a person can completely lose their memory, or even change their personality. History has many such stories. After injuries, strokes or operations, people started acting differently, lost their memories or stopped recognizing loved ones. Sometimes even their personality changed. A calm person became aggressive, or the other way around. What does this mean? It means that our personality isn't something separate from the brain. It depends directly on the brain's condition. And here's a key conclusion from science. If consciousness, memory, and personality depend on the physical structure of the brain, then when the brain is destroyed, they can't keep existing in the same way. From a scientific point of view, death isn't just a transition, it's the stopping of the processes that create consciousness. That's why most scientists are doubtful about the idea of reincarnation, because it would mean that information, memories, experiences, personality somehow stays outside the brain. But here's the problem. Where exactly? In modern science, there's no proven way that consciousness could be saved after the brain completely stops. There's no storage place, no recorded carrier, no observed way for it to be passed on. And that's a very strong argument against it. But the story doesn't end there. Because despite this firm stance from science, there are cases that aren't so easy to explain. Cases that don't fit into the usual model. These are the things that make some researchers keep coming back to this question and ask the uncomfortable but important question: do we really understand everything about consciousness? Or have we just not reached the level yet where we can explain it? Even though science is a bit doubtful, there are real-life stories that people still talk about a lot. One of the most famous researchers was Ian Stevenson. He looked into over 2,000 such cases all over the world. One of the most talked about is the case of a boy named James Leininger. From a very young age, around 2 years old, he started having the same bad dreams over and over. "Child, the plane's on fire! I can't get out!" Over time, the boy started to share more details. He named the type of plane, talked about the ship it took off from, and even said a name, James. Later, his parents checked the information and found an American pilot named James Houston, who died in the Pacific Ocean. Some of the details matched historical facts. The case became widely known and was looked into by experts. Another famous case is Shanti Devi. This was in the 1930s in India. From a young age, the girl claimed she had lived another life in a different city. She named her husband, described her house, and how she died. When she was taken to the city she mentioned, she recognized people and places she had supposedly never seen before. The case got the attention of politicians and committees. There are also modern studies by groups at the University of Virginia that show similar patterns. Children start talking about a past life when they are 2 or 3 years old. Their stories are often very detailed, and over time the memories fade away. But all these cases are not seen as scientific proof of reincarnation. There are still other explanations and things we don't know for sure. The stories sound amazing, sometimes even too amazing. But science works in a way that it doesn't accept conclusions based on surprise. It asks a different question. Can this be checked? Can it be repeated? Can all other explanations be ruled out? And this is where most such cases start to lose their mystical power. The first thing scientists look at is how reliable memory is. We're used to thinking that memory is an exact recording of events, but that's not true. Modern psychology shows memory is like putting something back together. Every time we remember something, we're not pulling a file from our brain. We're building it again. And when we do this, we can add, change, or even make up details that never happened. This is especially true for kids. Their brains are growing fast. Imagination and reality can get mixed up. And it's at this age, around 2 to 5 years old, that stories about past lives most often pop up. The second thing is how much our surroundings affect us. Even if parents aren't trying to make their kids believe something, they might ask leading questions. For example, what was your name? Where did you live? And the child, trying to answer, starts to fill in the story. Over time, this story gets more and more detailed and starts to feel like a real memory. This is called the suggestion effect, and it's something psychologists know a lot about. The third thing is coincidences. The world is huge. There are millions of stories, and sometimes details really can match up. A name, a place, an event. But the human brain is wired to notice things that match and ignore things that don't. This is called confirmation bias. We remember what fits and forget what doesn't. The fourth thing is how we understand things. Even researchers can accidentally change the results. If someone already thinks reincarnation is possible, they might see the information in a way that supports it. This isn't cheating. It's just how our minds work. That's why strict methods, checking, and independent reviews are so important in science. But even with all of this, there's still an honest point. Not all cases are easy to explain. There are stories where too many things match up, where the details really seem unusual. And here, science makes an important difference. It doesn't say, this is impossible. It says, we don't have a good enough explanation yet. That's a big difference, because not having an explanation isn't proof. But it's also not a final way to say it's not true. And this is where we get to the tricky part of this question. Because maybe the problem isn't with reincarnation, but with the fact that we don't fully understand what consciousness is. Up until now, we've been talking about memory, the brain, specific cases, and possible explanations. But all of this leads to one, much more basic question. What is consciousness? Not in the everyday sense, but at the deepest level. What exactly makes us us? Modern science has actually learned a lot about the brain. We can see which areas light up when we make decisions. We can track processes related to emotions, attention, and memory. But there's a problem. All this information answers the question how. But it hardly answers the question what. How a signal starts, how information is sent, how a reaction is formed. But why does subjective experience even exist? Why don't we just process information, but actually know we're doing it? This question in philosophy and science is known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term David Chalmers came up with. The main idea of the problem is this. Even if we completely describe the brain, every neuron, every connection, every reaction, we still won't explain why we feel like I, why there's an experience, why there's an inner world. You can imagine a system that acts exactly like a human. It answers, it reacts, it makes choices. But does it have consciousness? Or is it just pretending? And here's where a gap appears. A gap between physical processes and what we feel inside. And for now, this gap isn't closed. Some scientists believe that consciousness comes entirely from how the brain works. This is called physicalism. According to this idea, when we fully understand the brain, we'll also understand consciousness. Others think that consciousness might be more basic, not just something the brain makes, but one of the main parts of reality itself. There are even ideas that see consciousness as something that exists at a deeper level of the universe. It's important to understand this doesn't mean that reincarnation automatically becomes real, but it means something else. We don't fully understand yet what exactly can disappear and what cannot. And this is where a key turning point comes in. If consciousness completely depends on the brain, then it disappears after death. But if consciousness has a deeper nature, the question is still open. And this isn't just a philosophical game. It's a real scientific boundary. The boundary between what we know and what's still unknown. And that's why the next step is to ask an even more uncomfortable question. Not does reincarnation exist, but what would even need to survive death for it to be possible? Up until now, the logic seemed pretty straightforward. The brain creates consciousness. Consciousness depends on the brain. The brain dies. Consciousness disappears. But what if this picture isn't complete? There's one important thing that people rarely think about. We see a connection between the brain and consciousness. But a connection isn't necessarily the source. It could be an interface. Imagine a radio. It picks up a signal and turns it into sound. If the radio breaks, the sound disappears. But does that mean the signal itself is gone? Or just the device that was receiving it? Some thinkers and researchers have suggested looking at the brain in this way, not as the source of consciousness, but as a tool for it to show up. This isn't a proven idea, but it's a way of thinking that tries to explain one tricky thing: why subjective experience even exists. If you accept this idea, even just in your head, the picture changes. Consciousness might not be stuck to a specific body. It might show up through it, but not necessarily be completely limited by it. But here we need to be really honest. Right now, there's no solid scientific proof that consciousness exists outside the brain. No experiment has directly shown this, and that's why science stays careful. But there's another side to it. There's also no full explanation of how the physical stuff in the brain actually creates subjective experience. And so we find ourselves at a point where two ideas clash. On one side, the strict scientific model. Consciousness is a product of the brain. On the other, an open question. What if that's not the whole story? And here it's important not to go to extremes. Don't claim things without proof, but also don't close the question too soon, because the history of science has shown us what once seemed impossible later got an explanation. And now the main question sounds different. Not, does reincarnation exist? But is it even possible if consciousness isn't completely dependent on the body? And to answer that honestly, we need to understand why science still doesn't accept this idea. After all we've talked about, a natural question comes up. If there are strange cases, if there are philosophical ideas, if even consciousness isn't fully understood, why does science still not accept reincarnation? The answer here isn't about being skeptical just to be skeptical. It's about the rules that science itself is built on. The first rule is that it must be testable. Any scientific idea needs to be checked. This means we should be able to do an experiment and get the same result again. With reincarnation, this isn't possible. We can't guess where or when a new life will appear with memories from a past one. We can't make it happen in a controlled setting. The second rule is that it must be measurable. Science works with things that can be recorded, measured, written down, compared. But with reincarnation, there's no tool that can find the transfer of consciousness or memory. There's no device that would show, here, a shift happened. The third rule is about how it works. Even if we see something happen, science tries to understand. How exactly does it work? In physics, there are laws. In biology, there are processes. But here, there's a big missing piece. How can information, memories, experiences, personality exist outside the brain? How is it kept? How is it passed on? Through what? Right now, there's no answer. The fourth point is about other explanations. Science always picks the simplest explanation that fits the facts. If something can be explained by psychology, memory, how the environment affects us, and coincidences, there's no need to bring in a more complicated idea. This is called the principle of economy, or Occam's razor, and that's why the scientific community is careful, not because it denies everything unusual, but because there isn't enough proof yet to think reincarnation is a real thing. But there's an important detail here. Science doesn't say, this is impossible. It says, we don't have proof. And those aren't the same thing, because science isn't a list of final answers. It's a process, always making things clearer, checking, doubting. And that's why we come to the final point, to the most honest and difficult conclusion. After all we've talked about, it seems like we have a choice to believe or not to believe, to accept the idea of reincarnation or to reject it. But actually, the problem is deeper, much deeper, because the main question isn't about reincarnation, it's about us. We still can't say for sure what consciousness is, where our self is, and why subjective experience even exists. We know how neurons work. We can study the brain, we can see the processes, but we can't fully explain why there's an experience, why there's an inner observer. And this is where everything changes, because until we understand the nature of consciousness, we can't definitively answer the question of life after death, or the question of reincarnation. This is an honest conclusion. No big news, no grand statements. Science says we have no proof of reincarnation. Philosophy says it's possible in terms of ideas, and reality remains open. And maybe the most important question isn't, did you have past lives? But rather, who are you, really? If everything you think you are is just your brain working, then when it's gone, you are gone too. But if consciousness is deeper, if it's not just about physical processes, then the lines between life and death might not be so clear. We don't know the final answer, but we do know one thing. The more we learn about the universe, the more we understand how much more complex it is than it seemed. And maybe the biggest secret isn't far away in space, but inside us. Thanks for watching until the end. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, please like the video and write in the comments. What do you think? Does consciousness disappear, or does it continue to exist? You are watching Just Think channel, and this is just the beginning.